So, welcome to today's Orchestrator meeting. We have two topics on the agenda for today. The first one is Etsy hosts. That's a kind of a regression to DeepC and to Ceph Ansible and to Ceph ADM and Octopus. Kinda. So we have two pull requests, Sage.
Yep.
And yeah, that's the easy one.
Yeah.
And we have the other one.
Yep. So I'm just double checking the Podman and Docker behavior, and Podman isn't behaving the way I thought it was behaving for the original case for the get FQDN, and I'm trying to figure out what my error is. So give me like 1 second. Basically, it's a nightmare. It's a total disaster. So the problem is the ingress service in particular, but probably other things, need to be able to look up IP addresses to generate configuration files, and they can't do that. Get my Podman. They can't do that if the Etsy host file is modified. It feels like we stumbled upon the working combination. So resolve IP will work with Podman if we pass no hosts, which is what our original fix for the other problem did. And it also works in general in Docker. It'll return the actual IP address. But if we don't pass no hosts to Podman, if we just run Podman with no special arguments, it'll return the loopback address. And if we pass the add host, it also returns the loopback address. And if that happens, then we're kind of screwed because basically we can't rely on DNS in general. I summarize this right below. I already typed that in under resolve IP. We can't rely on DNS or Etsy hosts in general because it just won't work because it'll get over. Because if you happen to be looking up the host or the IP for the host that the manager is running on, then you'll just get the wrong address. So that sucks. I went back to verify the original dashboard issue, which is get FQDN or the socket.get FQDN is the original problem. And the problem there was that it was returning Ceph-FSID-or-AX, whatever, blah. Because there's this entry in Etsy host that's 127.0.0.1, host name, my container name that Podman adds. And that was screwing up the dashboard, tries to look up what its address is. It actually goes through some helper function, I can't remember. But it's like the host address that it advertises when you do Ceph Manager endpoints, or like how you reach the dashboard or whatever, is based on doing that get FQDN call. And it was returning the container name, which meant that the advertised address wouldn't actually work to reach the thing. That was the original problem that we were trying to fix. And we worked around that by doing -- no hosts on Podman, which didn't make this entry, and so get FQDN worked as it was intended to work.
What we need is a global view across the cluster and not that's independent of the current host, right? Because if we are looking from the current host, and we always get kind of a skewed look at things because the current host might be loopback.
Yep.
We have that already in get fact.
So, I mean, I guess the long and the short of this is that what is in master right now works by accident. Basically, both of these problems are avoided. The dashboard issue is fine because we worked around it by passing no hosts, and the resolve IP happens to work with podman no hosts. So what's currently in master is fine, except that you can't, if you're using podman, you can't rely on etsy hosts if you don't have DNS. So at the moment, it feels like the simplest thing is to just say for HCS5, you can't use etsy hosts. You got to have DNS or you got to specify IP addresses, which sucks.
So in order to isolate the issue, I think, at least from the dashboard side, you can set the server address, and that basically overrides this. Because this was mostly for guessing the interface and kind of inferring the IP address. But if you replace that with the config option, the IP address or server address, sorry, then you don't call this. So if that works, it may be a workaround for this.
I mean, we also, instead of doing this, we could do resolve IP get hostname, right? And that also works because of the above. Except that actually, I guess is that actually what the problem is? Like, is that what the...
Yeah, I was checking what this get QDM was trying to do from syscalls, and it seems like it was trying to get the hostname from the uname and other different sources. So yeah,
I don't think get hostname is a good idea when writing it. No, resolve IP. I don't think resolve IP is a good name, good way to resolve the IP when writing it into any config files or into any config stores.
I agree, which was why I wrote this pull request that basically tries to populate the IP field of hosts when you add them, when we know that resolve IP will actually work, and then use that IP. Yes, because you are never adding a host that is the host that you're running on because you haven't added it yet.
We're actually doing it. The Bootstrap host.
Yes, in the Bootstrap case, it uses the mon IP that you specified.
Oh.
But also, the Bootstrap code is running on the host and not inside a container, and so it could also do whatever. Like it can do whatever we want to do. I mean, I think it's a bit questionable whether you should rely on DNS for this anyway. Like, I really think it's better. It's a better practice for your host to have an IP that you specify that you use, because then you don't have this external dependency on DNS. If DNS changes, then suddenly your cluster breaks. If it goes down, your cluster breaks. Like all that stuff seems bad. And so with this pull request, then we basically force people to, if they didn't provide the IP for the host when they added it, it'll just look it up for you and add it with that IP address. And then when the configs are generated, it's passing that address through resolve IP, which is usually just an IP. So it'll just resolve the IP to get the IP. And that's mostly just for backwards compatibility. I think the main thing that pull request doesn't cover is like the upgrade case. If you have an Octopus cluster that doesn't have IPs for everything, you are relying on DNS and you upgrade, it won't like populate. It won't fill in the IPs for you. So it doesn't solve this.
You could do that, right?
We could, yeah. I just didn't do it in that pull request. And you have to be careful because, again, you still have this problem where if you try to look up the host that the manager happens to be running on, you don't get the right answer. So you would basically have to like populate all the fields that don't resolve to a loopback address. And then the next time the manager fails over to another host, it'll do the same set of checks. And then hopefully it'll be able to resolve the one that was missed last time. I guess. I don't know, whatever. It's kind of a messy upgrade, but that seems like the most reasonable path forward.
Do you think using the fact that we have for each host is sane in general?
Using what?
Paul returns a list of host facts for each host. And that's stored in the manager and it's accessible.
Yeah, but we don't really know which one is if there are multiple IPs on a host, we don't really know which one's the right one.
We have probably multiple IPs for each host. That's right.
Yeah. So I would prefer to make that, use DNS to make that initial decision. But I mean, I was looking at your comment on this pull request, and I was realizing that this is all talking in circles, because this whole discussion, the whole reason we went down this road in the first place was so that we could allow somebody to use Etsy hosts. But if the only way to fix this problem is to put the IPs in the host table, then we're not using Etsy hosts at all. Exactly. We're basically saying you can't use DNS or Etsy hosts. You have to specify IP addresses, and that's the only way anything is ever going to work.
Yeah, and which makes this pull request kind of pointless.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
think that if we try to cover all the different use cases, probably we are not going to achieve that. Okay, and I think because maybe we are trying to solve something in Ceph ADM that is not part of Ceph ADM or even the Ceph cluster. Okay, that is resolve domain names. Okay, so my view is that is something that is a resource that should be provided by the final user. The final user, in the same way that we are requesting some requirements, for example, Python 3 or LVM, we need to request that you need to have some kind of name resolution in your network. In that way, that we can use, I think the most simple function is get other address info from the socket library in order to get the information that we need to work, okay? Only working with the name of the host. I think that this is the right approach. If we try to cover all the different cases, probably we are not going to achieve that because we have a lot of variability. So I think that is a problem that we need to fix. This is the environment where you are going to have your cluster working with all the possibilities. And if you do not have this situation, then you are not going to. It's not going to be possible, for example, to use the ingress service because we need the name resolution. I don't know. I think it's my.
We don't really need DNS. We just need the IP for the configs. So if we, yeah. I mean, it really feels to me like this pull request that when you add a host, we resolve the IP and we just try to use that. That feels like the right path because we're just removing our dependency on all these external services, right? There's really no reason. As soon as you're relying on external DNS or Etsy hosts, it's like you're introducing all this possibility of things going wrong. I don't think it's a feature to rely on DNS because either the only two things can happen, right? It will go down and then things will break, or you'll change your DNS so and you want all the IPs to update. And I don't think that that's a common scenario. And even if it were, I think it's actually better just to tell the cluster the IP for this host to change. I don't think that's unreasonable. I don't think people would expect to change the DNS and the IP on a host and have all the software that's installed and configured and running on that host magically continue to work, especially a complicated system like Ceph or Kubernetes or anything Like that's totally non-trivial. Like that's just not expected. I don't think we should worry about that. And if that's the case, then there's no upside to rely on external DNS. There's no value in not using IPs in place of hosts.
If
Okay, so you are suggesting to use etc host, the file? This is your preferred?
I'm saying this pull request here, this one. We should just say best practice is to, when you add a host to the cluster, you specify what IP you want the cluster to use for that host. And we use that wherever possible. And all these calls to resolve IP in the code will either be removed or we'll be removing this, whatever. We'll be resolving an IP or whatever. So they'll only be there for backward compatibility or the upgrade.
Okay, case. So we have our view of the configuration of the system.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
When
provided by the user, that's actually what you wanted to do, Omega.
Sorry? One comment. Interesting. Yeah, please go ahead.
Ernesto?
No, I was just going to mention related, but yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. No, I was just remembering that when we were discussing the HA for the dashboard, one of the topics that arose there was the possibility of using services discovery, DNS-based service discovery. And I was exploring that and maybe just trying a tiny DNS inside the manager. And I was playing with the DNS Python library, which is a pretty simple. I'm not sure if we want to, unbox that thing, but at least it's just, to be aware that there's that possibility, just to get some kind of service discovery so we don't have to deal with IPs, at least from inside the cluster. We can perhaps deal with just names, and they could think of the DNSs that we can dynamically update that, which is something that I don't think we can do right with HCP host, which is more of a static mapping.
But that's orthogonal, Ernesto, that's orthogonal. Because of the problem we are solving here is kind of the view of the cluster itself by Ceph ADM, and a DNS server within the manager would be for the internal view of services within the cluster. They're two different. They're completely different. Not completely different, but they are orthogonal to each other. We can do a possible internal DNS independent of how Ceph ADM knows about the cluster.
Sorry, I'm not sure if I'm following you. No.
That's independent of the current problem here. Your internal DNS server wouldn't solve anything that we're discussing here. That's a problem. You know why?
You tell me.
The problem that we have right now is that Ceph ADM itself needs to know which IP has, which host has which IP. And we're doing it by kind of magically getting the IP address of hosts. That's in order for Ceph ADM to work. But a local DNS server in the manager, I don't know if that's a good idea or not. We can discuss it later. I don't know.
Yeah.
Would only solve the problem for services within the cluster, but not for Ceph ADM itself.
Okay, so you mean accessing the host from outside, right? The cluster, the services from.
Well, even if we had this DNS service, like the DNS service would have to know what IP to return for a host, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Ceph ADM would have to know the host IP mapping. And the problem is we don't know that right now.
Yeah. Main benefit I see, from this approach or from any other centralized approaches, that you only have to update the IP in one place. So you don't have to deal with many etc hosts or.
Yeah.
So what I see as a problematic is that existing ways to deal with hostname resolution is changing, and people don't like changes enforced by them. So especially if it's kind of surprising. So I think your pull request is kind of sane, Sage, right? But it's surprising to users.
I think it feels like it should just be accompanied by a bunch of set of changes to the documentation that like basically remove any reference that or make it explicit that when you add a host to Ceph ADM, you have to tell Ceph ADM what the IP address is for that host. And at the time you add it, if you don't provide that IP, we can use DNS to try to figure it out for you. But beyond that, like you can't use etc host, you can't use DNS, like Ceph ADM knows what IP address it is. Yeah, that seems like the way to do it. And the same thing with that, and then the dashboard code also that like returns the address to use. Instead of doing the socket.getFQDN, it should just look at which host it's on and then use the IP that we have for that host, right? Like it shouldn't do what it's doing now. Socket.getFQDN.
I think we changed that for a good reason, but I don't remember exactly which one was that.
Yeah, it just had
try
to be.
Yeah,
I imagine it just had to be something, and that was the
That part of the code. I will check the git log just to see, because I think that part has undergone some refactorings. So probably we fixed this. We made this just for fixing some previous issues. So.
Yeah. But in any case, if we make this change, like to use the real IP adder as host, whatever, then we don't need the other one to allow it to host with Podman.
Yeah.
Like we don't need that anymore. We basically just need some doc updates that will clean all this other stuff up.
No one reads docs.
No,
but
nevertheless.
It's too late.
Yeah, nevertheless. Well, I know that's why. I think that's why this is nice, because Bootstrap will just fill in the IP, and when you host that, it'll fill in the IP, and so you don't have to think about it. It's just going to work.
But we definitely have to make the address part non-optional, mandatory, and validate that's actually an IP address when adding a new host.
As opposed to doing a lookup and filling it in transparently. It feels like it works. Like we could change when you do a host add and it's a success, it seems like the message it returns, instead of just saying added host foo, it could say added host foo at IP and then list the IP that it filled in. So
maybe something like that, yes.
And if it's something out of whack, you'd be like, remove.
and we have to kind of document how to change the IP of a host.
Yeah. There are a couple issues there because the config files that contain that IP aren't listed as dependencies, and so we won't automatically reconfigure all the appropriate services if the IP changes.
Exactly.
But I'm not so worried about that, because like changing IPs is super rare, and it's also like you have to like change the IP on the host and the thing that refers to it at the same time, and there's whatever, it's like a coordinated update, whatever. I'm not so worried about it.
And we
I
have
wouldn't consider that a
to
block.
the first paragraph of this page is then also wrong.
Yeah. Yep, exactly. Yeah, I just rewrite this whole section, basically. Anyway, so I think action item basically is to take that, close this first etc host one, take this other one, and include the doc updates, and make the CLI command tell you the IP address it used if it looked it up. And yeah.
I'm okay with it.
Okay. And I'll do another git grep on resolve IP just to make sure I've caught all the, I mean, basically resolve IP we shouldn't be using. I think that, so the last missing piece that I'm not sure there's a blocker, but needs to follow at some point is the upgrade path, where we need to like clean all this up for clusters, existing clusters that don't have IPs. We need to fill them in when we can. I don't think that's necessary for the downstream release because it'll be new Ceph ADM setups, but we'll need it soon.
I think in general, a better idea would be to specify, or what I would like to have is some kind of using get facts. But magically resolve the problem of having multiple IPs. If we find a way for that, I would be more inclined to make use of get facts instead of forcing users to do the IP address. But I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah.
So
I think for upgrades, we should just use the use DNS, use resolve IP, because that's effectively what was happening before, and the cluster was working at the time of upgrade, and so we should just silently change it to what it was doing before, but then persistently store that IP.
Yeah, the upgrade case doesn't work because at that point we're no longer mounting etc hosts.
If we're not changing the behavior, then it's the same behavior as
in Pacific, but not in Octopus.
etc hosts. Fuck. Wait, I keep confusing myself because there's so many different cases. If that's the case, though, it doesn't work because if you run Podman without the no host argument or an add host argument, then when you do a lookup on your local host name that it's running on, it returns 127.0.0.1. I guess that doesn't matter. The cluster still functions. It just is connecting via loopback instead of the public IP. Okay. So I think, okay, in that case, I think the thing to do is, oh shit. This is such a mess. It's probably also revert that so that we're not passing those arguments with Podman. And then don't resolve the IP if it's a loopback. And then during the upgrade process, the manager is going to move between hosts. And so we'll always be able to look up that host from the other machine at some point. Anyway, I'm going to do that upgrade case in a separate pull request. Yeah.
What a mess. Okay.
Yes. Okay.
Okay.
Blah. In the meantime, then, I would like to merge the NFS pull request.
Yes.
That one. That
Isn't
one
it
is ready to go.
already approved, kinda?
Barsha had one last comment. I talked to her this morning. I think she's ready.
Okay.
Update. Hopefully she clicked. Oh, let me go ping her and see if she can resolve it.
I don't think she's online.
Well, whatever.
Wrong time zone.
Anyway. All right. If she doesn't reply soon, I'll just dismiss the review and merge.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
NFS LTW. Second topic. Turns out that we have a conflict flag in the Ganesha template that's corrupting NFS LTW.
So I saw Dan's comment, but then Matt didn't reply to that part. So can we just remove dir chunk equals 0 and will that magically fix everything? Or what is the purpose of this let thread should be on the list, basically.
Yeah. It occurred to me later.
Let me reply to this message. I'm adding Ceph devel, dev at ceph.io, and I'll add Jeff Slayton also.
Yes. And Varsha is also missing, so a bunch of people are missing.
Yeah.
Which URL is that one?
Did you send it already?
I'm sending it right now.
Okay. So where's the template? So we're talking about this Ganesha template here. And dir underscore chunk is corrupting NFS LTW. So the idea we had to properly resolve it is to remove the LTW block out of this template, right? And put it in the exports itself.
Yeah, so I talked to a bunch of people yesterday. It turns out that isn't the right solution, I think. So they're basically, so the fundamental issue is that the CephFS exports and the RGW exports work differently. So in the RGW case, you can have multiple export blocks with different credentials, but the credential is which S3 user is accessing that bucket for that export. But there's only one lib CephFS client instance. There's only one Ceph client. And so the RGW block, which is global, has the RGW user and CephX key or whatever for that. Whereas for CephFS, every single export block has its own Ceph client, which in and of itself is something that may or may not actually be what we want. But I guess that's a separate issue. And that's why each export block for CephFS has its own CephX user. So given that, I think the RGW block makes sense. I think the current behavior of how CephADM is configuring it, where we create that CephX user for the RGW client at the time we create the server, I think it all makes perfect sense. I don't think there's anything really to change there. Unless we want to change the high-level behavior, but I don't think there's any reason. Having a shared Ceph client for all the bucket exports makes perfect sense.
But that has the uncanny side effect that we do need these kind of additional blocks in the Ganesha.conf, like MD cache and
it means we need the RGW one, and it means, I mean, the other ones are. So I think, well, there were sort of two threads. The question of whether it's the right way to like set up the users and configure whatever, I think all that's what we have now is fine. So I think there's nothing really to change there. The bigger question is it in fact appropriate to use a single Ganesha daemon to export both CephFS and RGW? Which is something we decided a while ago, and we went and we removed that option when you create a cluster of what type of NFS cluster it was, whether it was an RGW one or an NFS one. But it turns out this dir chunk config is different between the two. So we need to confirm as quickly as possible that there is in fact a common set of global configuration options that is going to be fine for both daemons, and that there aren't other options that are going to come up later. So for example, in that thread, there was another one that he mentioned, like adder expiration time and only numeric owners are true. Basically, we need to make sure that for any global option, there is a value that's appropriate for both CephFS and RGW. That we'll never want to change. If that's the case, then okay. But if not, then we need to roll back that change that we made before so that they're separate Ganesha clusters, one for RGW and one for CephFS.
The utter expiration time is in an export underscore defaults block, which is not set by the Ganesha.conf. So
yeah, that's fine then.
That's fine. It can be put into a common config.
Okay.
That's independent.
So it's just this dir chunk. What was the other one that he mentioned? Only numeric owners. I don't know what that is. Let's see. Varsha sent me only numeric. Get in here.
Only numeric owners.
That is not an export. That's in the global.
Does it actually work to have one common config for both CephFS and RGW?
Yeah, that's the question. The other one that caught my eye was in one of the sample configs for RGW, there was an option called graceless. Which I think basically skips the grace period, which is not okay for CephFS, but for RGW is probably fine because there's no state. RGW is stateless. The RGW exports are stateless. It's not the end of the world. It just means that clients will, like, if there's a server failover, they'll have to wait a little bit for the grace period to expire before they can resume I/O. But yeah.
The graceless true config option is in the NFS v4 config block.
Yep, which is global.
Which is global.
Yeah. So basically, that'll always have to be false because we do need grace for CephFS. So the question is that okay that we apply that to RGW? Okay if there's a grace period for RGW.
I have the slight impression that we actually do need different templates for RGW and for CephFS. That's my gut feeling right now. But that has a big impact, right? It means that we don't have the possibility to have one Ganesha daemon that's both exporting RGW and CephFS.
Yeah. Yep.
Which is kind of
disappointing.
And it's different to what we expected to, or what we wanted to do. Mike, any thoughts?
I'd like to keep the same template if possible, because I think the complexity grows as soon as we go down this path with differing backends and differing. Yeah.
My sense so far is that all of the options that have come up, they aren't maybe like if you pick the common set, that'll work with both. It isn't maybe exactly what you would choose for RGW, but it's not fatal. Like, for example, not setting graceless true, I think it's fine for RGW. But it's maybe not what you would set if it was a dedicated RGW one. The one I'm more worried about is that that dir chunk thing, because I'm not sure if the reason why that happened was because it needs to be like a pass through into the FCL backend for every IO or every metadata operation, because we basically want to disable the caching for those. I'm not sure if it's a correctness thing or not.
But there was this bug I was able to discover. It was a couple of years ago. There was like a cache coherency problem between CephFS and Ganesha, which caused like memory to belong. And that seems to be the reason to disable the cache in this specific case. So it's almost like they kind of work opposite of each other in CephFS and RGW.
Yeah. That's. Do you have a link to that?
It's in the pad.
It's in the
It's in the pad. Okay.
Yeah.
Allow disable Ganesha caching. And that's cache inode. Yeah, that was the old name for MD cache. And it has dir and it's got chunk equals 0. And Azure expiration time as well. Oh, okay. This is pull request. It's really interesting here. So it feels like as if we are trying to solve the problems that Ceph Ansible solved a while ago already. Which is disappointing. And turns out Ceph Ansible has different templates for NFS.
But you.
CephFS and NFS LGW.
That's disappointing. Because it also means that the NFS servers have a type, right? It means that they're FFS ones and RGW ones, and you have to make sure that the exports are only added to the right type. That when you create the cluster, you have to decide which type it's going to be when you're like looking at it in the Orch whatever. Like, should it be like NFS FS and NFS RGW service types instead of NFS? Like, all this stuff gets gross. Got these assumptions that were wrong.
No, let's keep it with one service type. That having two different service types would be like giving up completely.
But we still need a different service property though that determines which kind of
Yeah.
NFS it is, right?
Yeah, and then we need to re-add the type
That argument, yep, for create.
for create.
Yeah.
I mean, you can kinda convert one Ganesha service to the other. You just need to redeploy the Ganesha.conf.
Mm-hmm.
And
Well, all
restart
of
the
it,
service.
yeah. All of the ones that are currently deployed are of the FS flavor because we don't support the RGW exports right now with Ceph IDM, right?
No, we do. We have the RGW block. It's not, but it's not right? You get those inconsistent read the results.
Yeah, because it's broken. So
Mike, that affects your downstream, right?
Eventually, yeah.
Mm-hmm. How did DeepSea solve it? Did DeepSea had also two different Ganesha.conf templates for two different backends?
I would have to go look. I'm not entirely certain. The majority of our use case is focused on CephFS exports.
it's a bummer that we can't control that option on a per export basis. Caching behavior. Is it worth?
No. Here's the adding it to the other pad. DeepSea has one combined Ganesha.conf for CephFS and for RGW.
So it basically didn't work with RGW then. What is the reason why?
Row MDS. No, actually, it two different templates. One Ginger template, but two different flavors. One for NFS and one for RGW. And the RGW flavor does not contain chunk 0, and the NFS, the CephFS flavor does not contain the RGW block. So, indeed, also DeepSea has two different types of Ganesha configs. So Ceph-IDM is really the only one having one combined template.
Hey, Jeff. We are realizing that Ceph-IDM's decision to have a single Ganesha instance that exports both CephFS and RGW is problematic. Because for CephFS, this dir chunk option has to be 0 or should be 0. I'm not sure exactly if it's a has to or should be. I think it's a has to for cache coherency issues, I guess.
Yeah, I'm a little unclear on that myself, honestly. I kind of followed, probably ought to drag somebody like, forgetting his name all of a sudden. Dan, like Dan Granowitz, you probably know. He's the one that recommended that originally. So Ganesha has some caching that it does for directory entries. I think that was supposed to reduce the amount of caching we'd get on directory entries, so that because libceffs is doing that for us at the times we want to do it. So we don't really need to have Ganesha caching them for us as well. a little bit more processing to have to do the conversion every time from whatever libcepfs has to whatever Ganesha wants, but it's not that big a deal, I don't think. So, but RGW doesn't like that, I take it.
That, yes. And so I'm trying to find out where he actually said that in this chat history. Or was it an email thread? I guess it's an email thread that I just forwarded. So Matt says that dir chunk 0 is fatal for RGW NFS. It simply cannot be used for RGW.
I guess for performance reasons.
Consistency reasons.
Okay. I would think that if anything, not caching would give you better consistency, but there's some I don't understand. But again, the way these tunables work in Ganesh is a little too. It doesn't seem to, not like you're turning off caching when you say that. What that says is like the size of the directory chunks that it's caching, I think, is 0. It's not really straightforward for tuning,
Right. So I guess it seems like we could save ourselves if the RGW SL could be made to work with dir chunk 0.
Yeah, either that or we come up with some way to just not worry about it for libcepfs. Or yeah, again, I don't really understand the directory caching that well. We really need one of the Ganesha guys in here probably to tell us what's what.
Do you know who that would be?
Either Dan or Matt, maybe Frank. One of those.
Daniel was engaged in this conversation. Daniel Greeney.
Yeah, Greinowitz. Yeah.
That's like all the Ann Arbor.
Dan would probably be the best person if we can.
Yeah, nobody in Ann Arbor is responding on RC. Okay. Well, I guess it's a question of, do we try to go down this road of maintaining a single type of Ganesha that can export both? It means that we have to have a common set of global options that will work well for both. And how willing are we to make changes even to Ganesha to make that possible? Or do we just give up and have 2 different types of Ganesha daemons?
I think for now I would give up and have 2 different types of Ganesha daemons.
Yeah, that's probably the best for now. Yeah, I think I agree.
As bad as it sounds, it having cache inconsistencies because of a config option is too bad in my opinion.
Yeah.
My feeling.
I guess if we do that, I would like to make it so that we can remove that restriction in the future.
Yes.
So, for example, instead of re-adding that type as a positional argument for the NFS create, maybe make it a flag that's like a flavor that at the moment is required, but in the future will not be required. Specify a flavor. And as a field that right now is required in the service spec, but in the future will be optional and or ignored. That makes sense?
I'm not even seeing that option documented in current upstream Ganesha.
Dir chunk.
Yeah, I wonder if they were doing a bunch of work on the redir stuff a while back. I didn't follow it real closely, but
see it here in the chat.
Yes, I see dir chunk all over the sources, but I don't see the config samples don't have it anymore.
Let's see it in config.
What was the?
But then we need to know why was it added in the first place, and if that reason is gone by now. That's the Ansible pull request.
Yeah.
We are kind of out of time.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, it sounds like we should just wait a little bit then until we have this conversation with the Ganesha folks. Have to sort it out before we make any changes on the Ceph ADM side. In the meantime, I guess there was that one unrelated issue question on the thing is what happens when you to the ingress service if you delete the underlying RTW service. Right now, it'll just throw an exception when it tries to do the config, but probably it should just delete it or something. I'm not really sure what it should do. I'm hesitant to have it delete itself because what if there's like a, I don't know.
Yeah. I wouldn't do anything.
Yeah. I think it's
I
fine.
wouldn't do anything. If we at some point decide to start implementing automatic migration for hosts that are offline, yeah, then at that point we start to do some kind of self-healing.
Yeah.
And till then, I would be super hesitant to automatically delete services if another service changes.
Yeah, agree. Okay.
Oh, I take it back. That option is still there in mainline Ganesha.
Okay.
I missed the caps, so get grep for it.
Yep. Cool.
Okay.
All right, thanks. I'll get on the host thing. I guess that's
Okay, thank you.
Another headache of the day.
Have a nice day.
All right, cool. All right,
Bye.
see you guys. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.